Ghostly greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Science of Scary. My name is Celia. I'm with RCIScience, and I'm the Virtual Engagement Coordinator. So before we begin, I'm going to start with a joke. What do you get when you divide the circumference of your jack-o'-lantern by its diameter? Pumpkin pie. So today we're going to have 3 short, spooky presentations. Each presentation is distinct, so we'll actually take questions after each one. You can submit your questions and comments in the chat box or via Twitter at RCIScience or email at information@rciscience.ca. So please send them in and we'll sort of address them after each presentation. Please be respectful and polite. Our moderators will be monitoring the chat and we'll be taking actions as appropriate. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first goal, Jennifer Chan. Jennifer Chan is a PhD student at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and she studies stress and health in first responders and other high-risk occupations. Using physiological measurements like heart activity, stress, hormones, and saliva, Jen studies how stress impacts our physical and mental health and immunity. Welcome, Jen.
Hey guys, how's it going?
I'm good. I like your costume. I'm glad that you dressed up for this.
I felt like the horns, so you know it's the closest I could do.
It's perfect.
So I think I got some of my slides. So it's real spooky season. It's my favorite season of the year. I love Halloween. And what great way, especially for a Science of Scary event, to start off with discussing what fear is and the science of fear behind it. So in order to kind of get into our discussion about what is fear, we should probably start with a definition. And if we start with fear as a noun, a fear definition is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or a threat. And if you're anything like me in that photo, I have a very low spook tolerance. And it's not an exactly fun feeling to have, but actually fear is really useful and has evolutionary purposes. Specifically, fear is what allows us to know, helps us figure out if something is dangerous or if we should stay away from it, or if we should change our behavior if it can harm us. And when this happens, this anticipation, our body goes through a number of physiological responses in order to respond to this potential threat. And we know this commonly as fight or flight. So what are some things that we find particularly scary? So there's a lot of things that are scary to us. There are a lot of different types of fears. And again, a lot of these can be rooted back into evolution and what historically has been dangerous to us. So for example, the fear of the dark could be particularly because we can't see very well. We can't see if there's a threat or something that can harm us. It's really difficult to tell. Another possible fear we might have are fear of spiders or snakes or other animals. And these fears could come from, again, they're venomous, they can harm us, they can be particularly lethal. And a lot of animal-based fears can be based in that. Another fear that I have, especially every time I go to the CN Tower and I look through the glass floor, is a fear of heights. And the fear of heights is a really interesting one because it's something that we have even when we're children. It's innate almost, that there's actually experiments in developmental psychology that show if you create this kind of false cliff. So you can see in that little photo that they create this box and there's a glass surface, but the checkerboard pattern makes it kind of look like there's a drop off. So to the baby, visually, there's that giant depth difference. And as much as the experimenter or the parent may try to call them across the gap, the baby will actually hesitate and try to avoid going over that edge because they seem to have this innate understanding that this drop could potentially harm them. And this is something that might be familiar for some of you, a fear of clusters of holes. If this gives you the creeps like it does for me, like this lotus seed pod, the clustering of holes kind of represents and looks like decaying or dying flesh. So that can particularly suggest disease or plague, and can become particularly scary to us. But there are things that are scary and things that are creepy. And what can we call things that are creepy? So things that are creepy are things that some kind of elicit a bit of a fear response, but not all the way that we need to decide whether we're going to fight and prepare to go against it or run away, but just makes us feel really uneasy. And a lot of things that are make us feel creepy have to do with things that are kind of vague or in between. So one thing that is really common is comes to faces. So faces are really interesting from a psychological standpoint. As babies, we can identify and have preference for faces almost immediately after we're born. And we're really good at identifying the main emotions like happiness, fear, disgust, sadness, anger. And when we have certain things that hide those emotions or hide our face, that can make it feel a little bit creepy. So sometimes, like a mask, will seem really creepy because you can't really see someone's face or true intentions or what they might mean to you, if they want to harm you, if they're friendly. Clowns are something that's really creepy to a lot of us. Again, it's the same thing with the face paint covering a lot of their face. Or things that can be creepy can also be things that are differentiated from what we're used to or what is normal behavior that we've attributed to being human-like over time. So, for example, if you have differentiating body proportions, kind of like the Slender Man down in the bottom corner, or even if you've like me and you've been watching a lot of TikTok, I've somehow found my way onto horror TikTok and found this lovely woman, Camilla Severin, who creates a lot of these really creepy characters. And you can see like those jagged movements aren't really normal, so we associate them. They're not quite human, they're not quite right. And something for us that we can't really figure out what is going on is actually really creepy and uncomfortable for us. So now that we have some ideas of things that are scary and things that are creepy and make us uncomfortable, what does fear mean physiologically? What is this fight or flight response that our body prepares for to go and get ready for that runaway or stand your ground and fight back? And there are a bunch of different things that our nervous system as well and the rest of our body do. One thing it does is we start breathing more, and this is to get more oxygen into our body because oxygen is a critical element that we need to help our muscles and our organs and everything work properly. We feel our heart beating a lot faster. If you're like me and wear a heart rate monitor, you can see when you get really anxious, your heart rate goes right up. And that's to get that oxygen that your lungs are pulling in and get it distributed throughout your body through the blood. Another thing that happens is that your pupils dilate, they get wider, so that way you can take in more of your surroundings and see those extra details to maybe help you discern a little bit more information about your surroundings and how you should react appropriately. And of course, your brain is taking all of this information and all of these preparations together to prepare a proper response to this potential fear. So it's good talk. It's not just a certain amount, just, you need to be aroused and you need to have all these things activate. It's all about having the right amount of activation. If you have the perfect amount of activation, you can do some really awesome things. Performance. You could have Jedi-like reflexes. You could take out a giant snake Horcrux, or you could telepathically lift a car. If you don't have enough activation, you might be a little too relaxed, a little too sluggish. You might not react fast enough. I use this GIF a lot, but I have never used it as much as I have this year. It's been quite a year for that GIF. And if your arousal system reacts too much and you're over-aroused and you're wired, you find that you don't perform as well. You might make brash decisions. You might have tunnel visions and just make the wrong decision, like grabbing a banana instead of a weapon to protect yourself. So it's all good and well to tell you about all of these different things that can happen. But what is better, in my opinion, is just to show you And I think the best examples come from animal videos, and I think some of the best animal videos are really cute cat videos. So here is one of my favorite videos of a cat watching the classic Alfred Hitchcock horror movie, Psycho. Just like a little bit of a warning for any younger audience members out there, there is a skeleton in it that can be a little surprising, so just heads up. But now that I gave you that little brief intro, we'll roll the clip.
Mrs. Bates.
So I love that video so much. It is such a good way to kind of see a bunch of those fight or flight responses in action. And even though the cat probably was more reacting to the sound rather than what was actually happening on screen, we get to see some really cool behaviors that we mimic what we do also. You see kind of his ears point towards the video a bit more so it can hear better what's happening. You can even see some of its hair start rising on his back, and at one point you see its pupils get really big, and finally you see kind of it get back on his haunches, prepared to kind of react in case something happens, and finally at the end, when you have that climax of the skeleton popping up and she screams, it decides, nope, I'm out of here, and just runs right out. And I think it's just a really fun and interesting way of showing how quickly our body can respond to these things and how almost it's happening without us really even noticing. Excuse me. So while we don't like scary things and we should stay away from these things that could potentially harm us, we seem to have a really particular fixation and interest in creepy things and the horror genre because it's been around for really centuries even. And it just pervades over and over again, and we seem to just love our horror movies. But why would we like something that is scary and can show us threat and harm, especially when we're watching something like a horror movie at home and we're supposed to feel safe and happy? And it's actually the fact that because we're watching at home, we feel safe and happy that has to actually do with it. So while we don't like things that are scary and can hurt us, we actually like a little bit of risk and a little bit of fear when we're in a controlled environment. And this can link back to a bunch of different hormones that are released during the experience of watching a scary movie. So first, while you're watching the movie, you have adrenaline, and this is the active hormone that happens when you're running or you're really stressed. And while you're watching a horror movie and you're watching someone get chased through the forest by the evil villain. But because you're at home and you know you're safe and you're in a controlled environment and the thing on the screen isn't going to jump out and you're not really at risk or in danger, serotonin is released. And this is a relaxing hormone letting you know everything's okay, you're safe, you're not going to be harmed. And once you finish that horror movie, you get a shot of dopamine. And dopamine is the chemical that's related to reward, that's saying, good job, you survived the movie, you survived this slightly scary experience, and you got off with a little bit of reward, creates this thrill-seeking exhilaration that we have after watching horror movies. And it's very similar to thrill-seeking behaviors, kind of like going on roller coasters or bungee jumping or cliff diving. However, sometimes when we watch these things, fear goes a little too far, and it's really difficult for our body to figure out what's really going to harm us and what isn't really going to harm us, and it gets really mixed up. And some disorders that can happen are things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, different kinds of phobias like we talked about, as well as high levels of anxiety and stress. And this can over time really drain on our body and our resources and really exhaust us. So what are some ways that we can get past these fears or conquer our fears? And one of the ways that we do it is through what's called exposure therapy. So exposing the individual to the thing they're afraid of. Now, we can't just expose them straight up to what they're afraid of. So they're afraid of, for example, like this cartoon, they're afraid of confined spaces, the dark, and heights. You can't just lock them in a box and suspend them off of a skyscraper. You have to do it gradually and build up the tolerance until you become less afraid of the thing. So, for example, if you're afraid of spiders, what you might want to do is start with something really cute, like Lucas the Spider, which is a really sweet animated YouTube series of this little tiny spider that goes on little adventures. And it's a kind of, not as creepy. It has really big eyes, so it's really cute. And it's a good way maybe to start if you were afraid of spiders. And then from there, you might want to upgrade a little bit more to perhaps videos of actual spiders. So for example, this is a peacock spider. I actually think these are really cute because they have these really bright backsides that they lift up, and when they mate, they do these little dances to try to get the female's attention. And it's really cute and kind of a nice upgrade. So you're going to, okay, again, it's a real spider, but again, not as scary. It's a little silly looking, a little goofy. Okay, once you get used to that, maybe you might present someone a spider in a jar. So, okay, this is a spider in real life right in front of you, but it's inside a jar, so it can't touch you, can't get directly against you. And then finally, from there, you might upgrade to trying to hold a spider instead, and leading to that final step of maybe eventually, and over a very long time, conquering your fear of spiders. And this can be applied to most fears that as long as you in a controlled environment where you're safe and you're surrounded by people you trust, slowly introduce these fears in a gradual pattern to slowly overcome them. And now that we have talked about stress and fear and how to come over it, hopefully next time you watch a scary movie, you will be able to get not as afraid, but hopefully with a bit of knowledge, not be able to fall asleep with the lights off. So thanks, you guys. It's really fun being here, and that's what I got for you.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that presentation. I loved all the GIFs that you were using and all the illustrations. It was great. Again, just a reminder for our audience, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box, tweet at us, or send us an email. We'll be directing or addressing them now. Your presentation actually reminded me of a quote that I found, apparently from Stephen King, who said, "We make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones." I think is very fitting.
It's a good way. It's in a way like, when you watch zombie movies and stuff, it's like, oh, well, the world isn't as scary as it is in fiction, because you always have that comparison of like, it's safe, and then, the world's literally on fire right now. So
yeah,
who knows? And, we got like a zombie plague basically coming, but.
Right. And that's great because we also have a zombie presentation coming up later as well. So that's a great reference. So actually we found this apparently scientific study that determined the scariest movie ever. Now, if you were to do a study like that, how would you sort of go about conducting the study?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit there.
Oh, sorry. I was asking if you had to conduct a study to find the scariest movie ever, what are some of the things that you would do to make it happen?
I would you'd want to get a lot of different people of all types of different ages, different backgrounds, different spook tolerances. I would definitely want to measure their arousal. So a lot of those physiological responses that happen, like breathing and heart rate, are really useful as far as objectively measurable responses to fear. Um, and with very controlled timing, you can show them very scary movies and things like that. Would be a really fun way to measure that.
Yeah. So we actually found one that determined the scariest movie ever by broadband choices, oddly. I didn't expect that source. And they actually tracked the heart rates of 50 people of different ages, and they watched over 100 hours of scary movies with, this is apparently important, a 5.1 surround sound. And then they came up with a list of the 35 most terrifying movies. And I guess surprisingly, they found that the scariest movie was Scott Derrickson's 2012 film Sinister, which caused the highest rise in BPM, or beats per minute. And the scariest movies that people usually say is The Shining, right? I think you showed. And that comes in only at 33. Number
really
33.
What's really interesting is that the one thing about heart rate, which a lot of people don't know, is that there's no real set window of heart rates that are considered really high or really low. Of course, you get above 100 threshold, but something really limited, like say 85 versus 87, it's really individual to the person. So what's 85 for one person may not be as stress as 85 for another person. So what would really be interesting if they showed the differences in heart arousal, and maybe I would like to know, if the people who watch these videos were like people who really like scary movies, because actually that's a pretty low heart rate in general as far as it goes. When I get really anxious before a presentation like right now, I am at 110 beats per minute for the last 20 minutes. So that would be interesting to see, though, as far as the comparison across different types of people.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. Yeah, I didn't really think about sort of the resting beats per minute, and you're right. Have they even seen the movie as well? Like, if you've seen The Shining a bunch of times already, it's like maybe less scary than maybe if you haven't seen Sinister. So that's actually really great. We even have sort of another. This is part of their infographic that they shared, and they had like the biggest jump scares by heart rate. So you have Insidious, Sinister, The Exorcist, The Conjuring, The Descent. And yeah, it doesn't even make top 20. The Shining.
I watched The Conjuring once in undergrad in my first year, and I could not sleep for about 2 days.
Oh my gosh.
And so it was like, it's fine, we'll watch it, with the lights on. It was in the middle of the day, and I could not sleep in my room. I had to sleep in her room with the lights on before. Yeah, it was not good.
Yeah, I can't really do scary movies either. I did watch Hereditary. Apparently it wasn't that scary when I watched it with my friends. Like, they didn't think it was that scary. I definitely found it scary, but apparently it ranks like number 4 on this. So that also surprises me. Yeah, and so we have actually a few questions as well. What is the most unique phobia you've come across in your research?
So my research doesn't focus too much on phobias specifically, but so I don't really have a personal experience of unusual phobia. But if it's a thing, there's probably a phobia for it.
Like, if it exists,
someone's probably it probably exists somewhere. So for example, I don't know, I don't know, the clusters of holes, like tryptophobia, that was a weird one when I first encountered it, because for me, it was like, why would someone be creeped out by holes? And then someone showed me a whole bunch of holes, and I was like, oh, that's extremely uncomfortable. And I think there's a frog that carries its babies on its back, and they emerge from the back. And I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's so gross. And yeah, it's so fear holes.
So you can make anything scary, I guess, if you wanted to. Yeah.
Anything can be scary to someone.
Yeah, for sure. Another question is there a genetic component to being able to watch scary movies, or is it more about exposure? Oh, great question. I'm curious.
Yeah, so there definitely is certain levels on a genetic as well as exposure basis. So, for example, your stress response is somewhat genetic, how much you react to stressors, if you release a lot of cortisol. That could be just one of the many ways that stress and fear can be controlled from a genetics factor. But at the same time, there is an exposure component to it. So, for example, if we see people who work a lot of night shifts, we actually see that their stress responses change over time because they're actually going against what their natural cycle of cortisol is. So that's one way we can see certain exposures and certain experiences can actually change how your physical chemicals work within your body.
Oh, wow. So those people who are on night shifts often, like, how do they respond to stress? Are they more stressed, like more easily scared, or the opposite?
So I'm not sure about as far as fear goes, but they would definitely be more stressed over time because their cycle is so all over the place. Their arousal might be a little more unpredictable. They may be overall just more stressed. Whatever it is, it won't follow along the typical increases and drops in stress throughout our day.
Right. Okay. That's great. Yeah. Another question that we got through email. I'm curious about how or why some horror themes are more prevalent at certain times than others. For example, UFOs and aliens in the 70s, slashers in the 80s, supernatural, zombies. Do they reflect collective fears or do they start them?
So in horror movies have a really interesting thing that they really like to draw themes from society. And that's something a lot of thrillers like to do. So so they do tend to draw from themes of the unknown. So for example, during the big aliens of the 40s and 50s, a lot of that did rely on a bit of xenophobia, the idea of people from somewhere else, people we're not familiar from or different from us, coming, taking over, hurting us. So that's where a lot of like alien fears come from. Zombies are really interesting. I could do like a big history lesson on like as far as societal zombies, but the idea of zombies actually comes back all the way from Haitian slave culture, and the idea of being brought back to life against your will, and the ultimate death for someone who is a slave. And a lot of the creepiness from that comes from the early 30s all the way back to its revival in the 70s and 90s, and then brought back again with The Walking Dead. So we like to have these recycles of themes and kind of like fashion trends almost in a way, but they often do have a root in, what societally is scary to us.
Oh, wow. I had no idea about that zombie history. So thank you so much for sharing that. And now I feel like I might just go research like all the different horror themes and like where they're connected in terms of societal sort of trends. Another question we got is spooky music and sounds more likely to provoke fear than what we see.
Yeah, absolutely. So music is a really great way to create suspense. And the reason this is because when we listen to music, we don't realize this, but over time in the years we listen to sound, we actually start creating patterns in our head and almost like a mental statistics of what to expect in music. So there are different ways that musicians can control how to create suspense versus certain chord progressions that we're used to hearing, and when it's not completed, it makes it really uncomfortable for us, or kind of like certain notes put together can sound really dissonant and just not good and grainy and against your ears like the chalkboard. And if you want to kind of get an idea of something that like kind of jarring, but maybe not scary, but jarring, to get the idea of why something might seem unusual and tense to us, if you're a Western music listener, if you listen to Eastern music, it'll actually have a lot of different chords and a lot of different scales that will be different from what we're used to and could actually be a little jarring. So that's actually how it's really good at manipulating our emotions through the soundtrack. The soundtrack is one of the most important parts of a horror movie.
For sure. Yeah, I feel like if you just like switch out music, that the movie is like definitely less scary than the original soundtrack that they would have. And then what about if like Eastern music listeners were listening to Western music? Would that be a very similar response as well?
It depends. There's certain things that, for example, we have chords that are very happy sounding. So like major chords, they sound really complete. That is pretty universal as far as between cultures go. The difference between Eastern cultures and the Western cultures, as far as the scale and the chords, tend to be they have a wider range of them.
Right.
In comparison, Western, or at least basic Western music in comparison is a little more standard, a little more basic. So we have not as broad of a range in those kind of things.
Oh, good to know. Nice, a little bit of music theory in here. Yeah, so I think that's it for our questions. Thank you so much, Jen, for your great presentation and all your amazing answers. I feel like I learned a lot in a really short amount of time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Next up, we have Dr. Salita Guy. She's a Toronto-based ecologist, data scientist, and science communicator. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto, where she studied bats as carriers of species-jumping viruses known as zoonotic diseases. And it's fair to say she knows more about bats than Batman. If you're local to Toronto, you might recognize Salita from her 10 years working as a host at the Ontario Science Centre. She has also appeared on TV and radio, had her writing featured in several outlets, including the book Fieldwork Fail, The Messy Side of Science, and started a children's community science program in Toronto's High Park. In exciting news, Dr. Guy is currently working on her first children's book for Annick Press, Adventures of Your Friendly Neighborhood Urban Ecologists, while trying to figure out how to balance industry, academia, and science communication. Wow, that is incredible. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Salita Guy.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. And for our audience members, sorry I'm going videos today. Hopefully my internet holds out for our presentation. Okay, can you guys, hopefully you can see this lovely picture of a bat. So I'm really excited. Much like Jen, Halloween is one of my favorite times of the year because I get to talk about, some of the science behind things that other people may think are spooky, but happen to be one of my favorite animals and kind of one of the animals that I think are the most adorable, and that is bats. Now, adorable may not be a word that you associate with bats, and the reason that I think they're so cute is probably because I spent so much time studying them. So as was mentioned, I did my PhD at the University of Toronto, where I was studying bats as carriers of viruses that they sometimes share with humans, but very rarely get sick from themselves. So, one of these kind of examples of these viruses is the reason that we are all meeting digitally today and not in person, unfortunately. But in addition to using math and computer models to make predictions about where in the world we should be looking for these kind of species-jumping viruses, I also studied bats right here in the city of Toronto to try to understand how their behavior changes when they live in cities. And that kind of information is really important. All right, so I think of bats and I love them. I have a lot of fond memories of catching bats here in the city of Toronto and in other places in Ontario, but a lot of people see bats and they're a little spooked out by them. And part of the reason I think for why people find these animals a little creepy is because there are a lot of myths and misconceptions that exist out there about them. You'll hear sometimes that they're just flying rats with wings. Well, this isn't true. Bats are kind of their own completely different group. Sometimes you'll hear that they get stuck in your hair. Also not true. I've caught, hundreds and hundreds of bats, never had one get stuck in my hair. But a lot of these kind of myths and misconceptions persist about them. And we're going to talk about some of these today. But I think one of the other reasons that bats come up a lot at this time of year at Halloween isn't just because people think they're creepy. It's also because we see them presented in really close association with other Halloween characters like vampires. So I'm a huge fan of Dracula, probably not surprising given how much I love bats. But bats are always portrayed as being in really close association with vampires. So in a lot of movies or books or TV shows, we'll see that vampires have this ability to either control bats, or sometimes vampires will change into bats themselves. And I think this association is kind of interesting. And that's why I think a lot of people, or this myth exists, that all bats kind of want to suck your blood or drink your blood very much like vampires. But this isn't there is some truth to this, like bats drinking blood. I want to introduce you to kind of one of my favorite species of bats, is Modus rotundus, or the common vampire bat. Now, don't need to worry. This species isn't found here in Toronto or even in Canada. Down in South America, the reason that they're called vampire bats is because it's the only thing that is in there, kind of an interesting way to live your life. But don't worry, these animals don't suck blood. Okay. Instead, what they do is they'll wait until a very large, generally large animal or bird is asleep. They'll fly down to the ground, fold up their wings, scurry around along the ground, and then they'll use their super sharp incisors or canine teeth to make a very small cut on whatever animal that they're feeding on. And they have these anticoagulants or things in their saliva that will prevent that cut from healing right away. And that will cause the blood to form a tiny little pool. And then they'll just sit and they'll lick up that blood, very much like a cat licking up milk. You're going to kind of have to take my word for it. Maybe it sounds super disgusting, but it's actually kind of cute to see happening in real life. And so there's kind of some truth to this idea that, some bats feed on blood, but it's only 3 species. And they actually don't kill the animals that they feed on. They take a little bit of blood, enough to have them be full, and then they'll fly off into the night. But I think this association between vampires and vampire bats, or bats in general, is a really interesting one. And, I was kind of curious as to where this association came from, like what came first, the vampire back, and you look at old vampires. We've had vampire legends time. Some of the earliest legends about humans feeding on blood came from the ancient kingdom of Mesopotamia. But the word vampire doesn't actually enter into the English language until 1734. And the word vampire is actually an old Slavic word. And all of these kind of Eastern myths about vampires didn't actually involve a vampire having the ability to control bats or turn into bats. So the word vampire appears in 1734. The first species of vampire bat is described by Western scientists in 1810. So vampire bats actually get their name from these mythological creatures or mythological beings who could suck blood. So I think it's kind of cool that bats get their name from old Eastern European vampire mythology. But this formal link between vampires and vampire bats, it actually doesn't even happen until much later, after 1810. In 1897, when Bram Stoker publishes the novel Dracula. And Dracula is actually the first place in writing and so I just think that's a really kind of cool connection between those two things. Excited about then his bats are super cool. And I basically like to pitch it as the fact that they have superpowers, unlike Batman, who just had a lot of money and a really cool utility belt. But it's true, bats have actual superpowers in that they can do things that no other mammal is able to do. So first off, we'll start with what I think is the kind of coolest trait they have. They have this ability to fly. So bats are like you and I. They're mammals. That means they're warm-blooded. They give birth to live babies who they nurse with blood, and they're fuzzy. They've got fur on their bodies, but they're the only mammals that are capable of powered flight. And flight, to kind of highlight how special flight is as a trait, flight has only evolved 4 times in kind of the history of ever. Bats can fly, birds can fly, insects can fly, and the 4th group was pterosaurs, who are now extinct. Okay. Now, bats fly. They are nocturnal. Most species will come out at night. And I forgot I put this one in here. And the other cool thing about bats, the way that bats fly is their wings are just modified hands. So right now we're looking at a picture of a bat that has been caught in a mist net. That's how we sample them in the wild. You can see that their wings are stretched out here. And what you see is those long bones in their wings. Those are actually their finger bones. So bats just have super, super long fingers, skin stretched between them, and that's what makes up their wings, which is pretty cool. And because bats come out, a lot of species have developed this kind of extra sense or extra ability to help them navigate or get around their nighttime environments. And this ability is called echolocation. So a lot of species of bats, but not all of them, will send out really high frequency sound waves that they'll use to help them get around in the dark. High frequency sound waves are above the range that human ears can hear, but they'll go into the environment, they'll bounce off of objects, come back to that bat and tell them, that there's a wall over here that I should avoid, but there's a tasty insect right in front of me that I want to eat. And now you'll often hear the phrase as a result, because they use this kind of sound to help them navigate in their environments, you'll hear the phrase blind as a bat, okay? This is not true. It's another one of these kind of myths that exists about bats in society. Bats that echolocate can still see, some not very well, but they can still see. But there are entire groups of bats, like our flying foxes, which I'm showing you here, cannot echolocate, and they rely on these big eyes to help them get around in the dark. So some and they rely on their eyesight to get around the dark, and they actually see much better than we humans can in the dark. So if anyone ever says, you're blind as a bat, say that's not true. Bats actually see pretty well. Kind of shout out to bat moms. So all moms in the animal kingdom do a lot of work to raise their babies. Bat moms are particularly special because they've got superhuman strength. So at birth, a bat baby weighs about 20 to 25% of mom's body weight. So to put that in perspective, I am a 150-pound woman. That would be like me giving birth to a 40-pound baby. Okay, your average baby is like 10 pounds. That's actually a little bit heavy. But so imagine like if humans gave birth to 40-pound babies, that's exactly what it's like when a mother bat gives birth. But not only is it like me giving birth to a 40-pound baby, it would be like me pregnant with a 40-pound baby sprinting everywhere full tilt, because that is how expensive flight is. And what's even cooler is that after bat babies are born, sometimes moms have to move them from spot to spot or from roost to roost if there's danger, because they can't fly for the first few weeks of their life. And so for moms to move their babies, they'll actually have those babies grip onto them really tight, and then they'll then fly something that is now more than 25% of their body weight to another safe location. So pretty amazing, pretty incredibly strong animals. The other cool thing about bats is that they live for a very long time. So the general rule, kind of, if you look at organisms or you look at mammals, is that the larger you are, the bigger your lifespan, or the longer your lifespan. So animals like elephants and whales can live to be hundreds of years old, whereas if you look at things like so very small, very short lifespans. Despite being so small, live to be over 30 years old. That's an incredibly long time for an animal this size. And because of that, a lot of scientists think that by studying them, we might kind of unlock some secrets to anti-aging in humans. And because these animals live so long, they are actually able to form these really complex social interactions. And so they have relationships with other individuals that they'll continue to maintain for their entire lives. And they have a complex social structure that is a lot like the social structure of whales or elephants or humans. Now, so far, I've been telling you kind of things that lots of bat species share in common. However, there's a lot of diversity or differences in this group that I want to highlight too. So there are currently over 1,400 living species of bats. And the exciting thing about that number is I say approximately 1,400 because we're still discovering new species to this day. So that number, last I checked, sat at about 14 species. Bats are and they count. That means if I lined up all the warm-blooded fuzzy things on the earth that gave birth to live babies, your cats, your dogs, your giraffe, every fourth species would be a different type of bat. That's just how many there are, which is pretty spectacular. And when you start to kind of break this down, break this apart, and look at all that diversity, there's so many species or so many like differences between them, and some of them actually look quite funny, right? Like if you look at this slide, we've got a bat down here that has this this mohawk. That's our Champlain freetail bat. We're actually not 100% sure why they have this mohawk, which is kind of cool. You also have bats that have these really interesting projections on their nose. We call those the trident or speared nose bats. We think that helps them echolocate better. So there's a huge amount of diversity in this group. And I think one of the ways that this diversity is kind of best exemplified is in all the different sorts of things that bats eat. And so when you look at bat diet is incredibly diverse. There are kind of different species that live their lives in really different ways and eat some pretty cool, pretty different things. So by and large, most species of bats are insect eaters. Okay, but even among those species that eat insects, like all of the species that we have in Canada and most of the species that we have in North America, among those insect eaters, there are kind of some really interesting species like the pallid bat. So the pallid bat can be found in the southwestern United States, and it feeds almost entirely on scorpions, which is a pretty dangerous thing to be having for every meal. But the kind of cool thing is the venom from these scorpions doesn't actually really affect these bats. It doesn't have the same effect that it would have on other mammals like you and I. In addition to our bats that eat insects, we also have lots of species of bats that are carnivorous, so they feed on meat. So here we have a species of bat that has a bird in its mouth. So there are some species that it eats birds. There's another species of bat that's carrying off a rodent. So some eat rodents. There are big bats that will eat smaller species of bats. There are bats that eat frogs. So lots of bats that will feed on kind of anything that is available. But in addition to these insect eaters and these ones that are carnivorous, we also have species that prefer to eat fruit. So they will feed on any type of fruit that they can find. These are the species that live in warmer tropical climates. And we also have several species of bats that feed almost entirely on nectar and pollen. And as we've already talked a little bit about today, when we're talking about vampires, we also have 3 out of only 14, or sorry, only 3 insects to plants to nectar. Bats, they end up doing a lot of really important things for our environment. So the bats who feed on insects, they act as free pest control for our crops, which is pretty cool. It means that we don't have to use as many pests feeding on things like our trees, who tropical. Adults watching today and you happen to enjoy tequila, you pollinate agave, which we use to make tequila. They also pollinate things like dirt and cocoa, which we use to make chocolate. And those bats that feed on seeds, they're really important for dispersing, the bats that feed on fruits are really important for dispersing seeds in our ecosystems, making sure that our forests grow up big and strong. So, even if you find bats a little creepy, even if you like to associate with them with vampires and Halloween, you find them a little bit spooky, that's okay, so long as you realize that, we and our planet needs them. They're super important, and we have to have them around so that we continue to have healthy and functioning ecosystems. And so that's all I'm going to share with you today about bats. But if you have any questions, I am more than happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Sailita, for this presentation. I learned a lot about bats, and I definitely have a greater appreciation for them and their diversity. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah, and again, as Sailita said, please submit your questions if you have any, just in the chat box or through email or Twitter. We can definitely address them right now. For me, I have a question for you. Do you have a favorite type of bat?
Yes, I do. And I'm actually going to jet back a couple of slides because I put it in. If you look down in the lower corner at the white bat with low ears, that is the super cute. This is a Honduran white bat. I just think they're adorable. They're about the size of your palm. They live in South America, and what they actually do is they're a type of tent-making bat. So they'll find these really large trees in the forest, and then they'll along the main kind of seam in the middle of that leaf so that the leaf folds in half, makes a little tent, and then they'll roost or they'll spend a day up inside that leaf. And so if you're walking through the rainforest and you look up, you see kind of these little things that look like cotton balls hanging out under this little leaf tent that they made for them.
Yeah, I think they're really cute. I think you broke up a little bit near the end there, but I definitely noticed this bat because I always think of bats like the other ones are sort of gray and brownish, but this one's white, so I like super unique. So I think you have selected a great one for your favorite. So we also actually found another article about vampire bats, which I hope you can maybe talk a little bit about. This article says from New York Times that vampire bats self-isolate too. And the caption says, when these mammals are ill, they have fewer interactions with family and friends. A new study suggests it's like us, said one researcher. Do you have any sort of initial thoughts about this article?
Oh, so that's super cool. I actually haven't had a chance to see this article yet, but it doesn't surprise me. Vampire bats have chips. Vampire bats are...
Oh, I think we lost Silita for a second. Hopefully she will be back. But from what we've read, sort of digging into that article a little bit further down, is that, sorry, just to find my notes. Yes, they have less energy when they're sick, and so they end up calling out less and grooming each other less, which makes sense whenever like anybody is sick. Me for sure. Like I just don't really want to do anything. I don't really want to talk to anybody. Just sort of like one word answers and questions and stuff like that. So that totally makes sense. Whenever Salita gets back, perhaps we can come back and ask her more questions. Again, feel free to submit any that you have, and we can talk about them afterwards if you have any. So now we're going to move on to Amanda. She is a microbiologist and a recent PhD graduate working as a research associate at the University of Toronto. Dr. Amanda Very helps support research programs exploring how microbes, especially fungi, can cause disease in humans. Earlier this week, she took over our Instagram channel to share her love of microbes. So please visit our Instagram, instagram.com/RCIScience, and follow her takeover, which we've saved in the highlights. They were really fun, very visual. I loved them. So hopefully you guys can check those out as well. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
No problem.
I think I have to apologize on behalf of the microbial world, as fungi are actually one of the major causes of bat extinctions.
Oh, no.
Because of a syndrome called white nose syndrome that fungi cause, that cause them to wake up from their hibernation, and then they don't have enough energy to survive. So I apologize.
Well, thank you for letting us know that as well. A very great connection. I'm just going to let people know to submit your questions as Amanda presents. Feel free to do so. We can address them afterwards. Thank you so much. You can take it over.
Perfect. Great. Okay, so as Celia said, my name is Dr. Amanda Very, and I am a microbiologist that works at the University of Toronto. So I'm going to talk to you today about whether you should fear the living dead, and I'm going to give you my guide to zombies. The first thing I want you to do is very serious. I want you to imagine you're walking through the forest, and you look down, and you see these protrusions that we see on the slide here coming out of the ground. Now, the first thing you think is, could it really be a person was buried alive? Or is it a dead person that is coming back to life? And these are their fingers coming out of the ground. but actually it's a mushroom. So this is a mushroom called Xylaria polymorpha, or dead man's fingers. And it's called that because it looks like dead man's fingers. And I wanted to share this to show you that sometimes nature can be just as scary, or if not scarier, than fiction. Perfect. Ooh. Okay, so as a microbiologist, I study microbes, and microbes are very small living things that you can't see with your naked eye. So as scientists, we use powerful microscopes to be able to study them, or we look at thousands or millions of individual cells of these microbes growing together so we can see them with our eyes. And here on the side, I have some pictures to find ways to make microbes beautiful. And I think they're really fun. So microbes are found absolutely everywhere, and there are both good microbes and there are bad microbes. And so, of course, currently, as we're living through a COVID-19 pandemic, we all understand the devastating effects that microbes can have. But I want to make sure that you know that there's a huge diversity of microbes, and they play such an important role. Just like bats play an important role in the ecosystem, microbes play a huge role in our world, and we couldn't live without them. So they help to make different kinds of delicious foods like bread, yogurt, and cheeses. They actually help us digest our food by being in our gut and helping us to break things down. They help recycle nutrients. They help make us useful medicines and so much more. So we really need them in our lives. Okay, but you're here to talk about zombies, right? And whether it's in the movies, the TV shows, or in video games, zombies are really popping up everywhere. And so what I'd love for you to do is to let me know in the chat what your favorite zombie is. So what TV show, movie, or video game is your absolute favorite that has to do with zombies? And I'd love to have a battle of the zombies and see who wins. Now, all of these zombie different portrayals may seem very different, but they all have one thing in common. It's that microbes are causing the zombies. And you maybe didn't notice that, and maybe you don't know what the microbes that are causing your zombies that are your favorite actually are. And that's okay. That's not your fault at all. Because a lot of the times these microbes play a really, really small role in the movies. And often we know that zombies can spread their infections by biting humans and passing on the zombie-causing agent. They almost never really talk about what these different microbes or causing agents are. So they often use really vague terms like infection, pathogen, or contagion. But what we know in real life is that we can't treat infections unless we know what they are. You need to know what kind of infection you have. So to really understand zombies, we need to understand the microbes. And so I'm going to go into a little bit about the different kinds of villains that can cause zombies and infections in real life. So our first villain are fungi, and these are the most closely related to humans of all of the microbes we're going to talk about today. And they can cause infections like athlete's foot and yeast infections, as well as more serious infections in your bloodstream. Next, we have bacteria, which are much smaller, and you might be more, you might know of these a little bit more. They cause a lot of different infections like strep throat, or even things like food poisoning. Next up, we have the villain viruses, which of course are really scary right now because we're currently dealing with COVID-19, but they also cause more simple infections that are more common, like flus and colds, and other serious diseases like HIV. Now, our last villain is someone you might not have heard of before, and these are called prions. And what's really interesting about prions is they're actually not living at all. So to explain this, first, your body is currently made up of a lot of different proteins, and these are just like building blocks. And these proteins take on a particular shape. In this case, I'm using a circle, just to demonstrate. Now, what a prion is, it's a version of one of these proteins that's lost its shape. And so it's also lost its function because it's no longer looking like it should. But what's really dangerous about these prions is when they come into contact with a normal protein, they can then cause it to change its shape. And this can lead to a massive spreading of disease as other proteins lose their shape and their function. And these prions are really scary because we really don't know how to get rid of them. Okay, so now that we know all the villains that can cause zombies in movies and video games, we need to think about, could microbes ever really cause zombies in real life? And so to do that, let's put our stethoscopes on and think about what actually is a zombie. So let's think about the symptoms. And I'd love if you would write in the chats what you think makes up a zombie. So what are the traits that you think are important? Now, I came up with a couple myself that I'll go through. So first, I think that the zombies are decomposing, they lose their motor function, so they're maybe not moving properly, they groan, they lack proper communication. They're often angry and violent, and this goes hand in hand with them biting and eating people, and they use that to spread the infections. They can also be foaming at the mouth, and the most important is that they're dead, but they seem to still be moving. And this movement that they have is not controlled by their own free will. It seems like something else is controlling them. So that seems like a lot of scary symptoms, and we really need to ask ourselves, are there microbes that can cause these symptoms in real life? Because if there are, then that means zombies might actually be possible. So let's start with decomposing. So there is a kind of infection that does cause your skin to decompose, and it's called necrotizing fasciitis or flesh-eating disease. And this is caused by many different kinds of bacteria, but one is called Staphylococcus aureus. So what happens is normally your skin provides a protective barrier against all kinds of bacteria and other microbes. But if you get a really, really deep cut, all of a sudden those microbes on your surface can get deep within your tissues. And that's what we're seeing in this picture here. In this cartoon, you have bacteria that are deep within the tissues and are able to grow and divide. And as they do this, they release toxins that then cause damage to your cells. And this can lead to a rapid infection that causes a lot of pain, blisters, changing in color, and then leads to death of the tissue. And as that tissue dies, then it starts to decompose. Okay, let's move on to motor problems, groaning, and angriness. Are there microbes that can cause this? And the answer is yes. So there's a disease called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or more commonly known as mad cow disease. And you may have heard this having been a problem in the past in the UK and in Canada. Now, this is caused by a prion disease, and these prions get into the brain and spinal cord of cows. And as I mentioned before, with the prions, it can spread to different proteins in the brain and the spinal cord and slowly cause them to no longer be able to function properly. And as the spinal cord stops functioning, then the cow is no longer able to move properly, and it causes them to lose their balance and coordination. As it causes more problems in the brain, because this can then lead to changes in behavior, anxiety, and anger. And so we really have these behavior altering traits that can make you really angry. There also is a similar disease that infects deer. Okay, so what about some of the biting and the foaming in the mouth? Well, that can easily be caused by rabies. And I have to say rabies is the #1 thing that I'm scared of, but that's probably because I'm deathly scared of raccoons. But rabies is caused by a viral infection called Lissa virus, and it spreads by the scratch or bite from infected animals. And this usually comes in either raccoons, bats, or dogs. So what happens here is the virus that infects these animals causes them to change their behavior. So one thing that happens is they get very angry and aggressive and they start biting. But one of the other things that happen is they get this weird fear of water. And you might think, why would it do that? But actually, it's so that the animals that are infected don't go and drink water or wash themselves. And so this means that there'll be a higher accumulation of saliva in their mouth as they start salivating more, and they're not washing it away. And what's interesting about this is in that saliva is where you have all of the viral particles. And so they're getting concentrated and concentrated in the mouth. So as these animals are foaming at the mouth and then go to bite an unsuspecting victim, in that bite, there's lots of viral particles that can then cause the transmission of the virus. So the virus is controlling the animal to help it transmit more. And what's really scary about rabies is immediate medical attention is essential. We do have ways to treat these rabies infections, but because it's such a serious virus, we need to get medical attention quickly. Okay, now those are all simple, maybe understandable, but what about the last two? Dead, but moving, or lack of free will? That can't really happen in real life, can it? Well, first, to understand this, we first need to know about parasites. And parasites are living things that grow within another living thing or host and benefit at the expense of their host. So I like to think of this as if you invited a friend over to your house and they eat all of your food, they invite all of their friends over, and they throw a wild party. They're having lots of fun, but it's at your expense because you're running out of everything and your house is a big mess. So that's what a parasite is. Now, in this case, in nature, we have mind-controlling infections caused by parasites. And here I'm showing you one called the Ophiocordyceps family of parasitic fungi. And they infect insects, but especially ants. So what happens to these infected ants is as the fungi is multiplying within them, the fungi causes the ants and forces them to start climbing up on top of different sticks or leaves. And this puts the ant at a better position for the fungi to spread to different places. So once the ant climbs up, the fungi actually kills the ant and starts growing out of its dead carcass, which is kind of creepy, right? But it grows these long, different projections out of their dead carcasses and then releases fungal spores that can then be spread through the area and infect more zombies. So in this case, the fungi are actually controlling the minds of the ants to be able to further its transmission again, which is kind of really creepy. Now, recent studies suggest that these fungi might actually control the ants by releasing chemicals that control the ant muscle movement. And this is because they find that the fungi are actually in the muscles of the ants and not actually located in their brains. Now, next we have another mind-controlling infection in nature, which is caused by another fungi called Masopora, and this affects cicadas. So what happens in this case is the fungi is growing inside of the cicadas and basically is hollowing out the cicada to the point where the abdomen of the cicada completely falls off, and instead you get this big plug of fungi that is growing out of it. So this big white plug here is all fungi. What happens then is even though the cicada is dying, it's decaying, it still acts completely normally to the point where none of the other cicadas notice anything different. So it's flying around, and as it's flying around, parts of this fungi can release out and spread. And they call this the salt shaker fungi because it releases like a salt shaker as the cicadas fly. The other thing the fungi does, which is really creepy, is it makes these cicadas hypersexualized. So these cicadas are more excited to mate with all different kinds of cicadas. And this again helps the transmission of the fungi as these other safe or uninfected cicadas come to mate with these infected cicadas. So it's kind of really disgusting in a way that the fungi are controlling this almost dead organism just for its benefit. And recent studies have identified that the fungi actually produce psychoactive compounds as well as compounds like amphetamines, which are a good way to suggest why they can how they can alter their behavior. Okay, so now that we looked at all these different symptoms and I found you examples of places in nature where we have microbes that can cause these infections, we really need to know, does that mean that zombies could happen in real life? Should I be scared? And the answer is, it's incredibly unlikely. So in a lot of these cases, I've showed you infections that were happening only in animals and aren't able to infect humans. And while we do see cases of humans getting infections from animals, they aren't super likely, especially if you're coming from an animal that's very distantly related, like an insect. It'd be really hard for a fungi who knows how to infect an insect that then infect and control a whole human. We also talked about a lot of different microbes that only had one or two of these symptoms, so it'd be really hard to get a microbe that caused all of these symptoms. But I like to think with science, nothing's ever impossible, so I guess you never know. Now, the best way to protect yourself against a zombie apocalypse, if it ever were to happen, would be the same way to protect yourself against COVID-19 or any other pathogen. So this would be wash your hands frequently, avoid touching your eyes, mouth, and nose, and cover your cough or sneezes with your elbow or tissues. And this just helps to stop the spread of infections, stops microbes that are pathogenic from getting inside of you and then making you sick, because when you're sick, you are more susceptible to subsequent infections. So it's always good to keep your immune system strong and to stay healthy. Next, it's a pretty good idea to stay at least 6 feet apart from any prospective zombies, just so they can't attack you, just in case. Also staying at home as much as possible during these times when we know that there are infected people out there. If there was a zombie apocalypse all around, you would probably want to stay at home with your door shut and locked. And lastly, if you have symptoms, to seek out medical care, because sometimes doctors know the answers, or a lot of times doctors know the answers and can help you to try and make you feel better. Okay, but I know what you're really asking is, okay, but that's not really what I came here to learn about. I really want to know, what is the best way to kill a zombie? And so I would love if you would all write in the chat what you think is the best way to kill a zombie. There's lots of different ideas, but I wonder which one is the best. So to start, I will absolutely say that the movies, the video games, and the TV shows get this 100% wrong. They absolutely almost always take an approach like this, where how to kill your zombie is to choose your weapon, maybe a baseball bat, aim for the head, and don't miss. But based off of everything I've told you, this is a bad idea. So first of all, if you pick a baseball bat and you have to hit them over the head, you're coming way too close in contact with that zombie, and that's leaving lots of opportunity for them to share their infection with you. Next, if you hit them in the head and you spread all of this blood and guts everywhere, now you have infected blood and guts that is spread everywhere. That's a way, way, way terrible way to do it, because now you have all of those fluids that you can catch the infection from. So not good. The movies are all wrong. So the answer instead is fire. So my expert microbiologist opinion is flamethrowers is the best way to go. Keep your distance, but throw the fire, and this will help to destroy the body without spreading those infectious bodily fluids. We also know in the research labs that fire and heat are really effective at killing different kinds of microbes, and they'll also melt the brains of the zombies. So I think this is the surefire way to do it. And thank you, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that. That was really great. I think we're all empowered to know what to do when a zombie comes. Yeah, I think someone suggested to stick a pencil in their ear. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, so again, I think you would have to come way too close to the zombie to ever make that effective, and staying far away is very important.
Yes, definitely. I think we all have good practice with that now.
Exactly.
So we've had some, I guess we've heard that like mad cow disease, there's sort of like this misinformation that we're hearing about transmitting to humans potentially. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So lots of places will say that people were able to get mad cow disease by eating infected cow meat, and that this would cause a disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And while that disease does exist and does cause neurodegeneration, there is not good evidence that this has come actually from eating infected meat, and that the mad cow disease is transmitting into humans. So I think that there's definitely a lot of misinformation around that.
That's really good to know. Yeah. And I guess this question might relate a little bit to what we were just talking about. Do you think that chronic wasting disease, also known as zombie deer disease, has the possibility to transfer to humans through infected meat, or would other humans pass it to each other by bites?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was reading up about this a little bit last night. I think that there is no evidence to suggest that that is able to pass through humans eating infected meat. It is, again, anything is possible, but we don't have data to support that right now. I think we do know that other infections and other microbes can spread by eating infected meat, but in those cases of mad cow or chronic wasting disease, we don't have evidence of that. I think what can happen with a lot of infectious disease is, especially ones like that are transferred through vectors like mosquitoes. We know that if a mosquito eats you and can transfer the disease to you, then another mosquito can come and bite you and take the infection and bring it to somebody else as well. So I think it is possible to spread it through vectors.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know specifically if that one spreads through
Right.
vectors, but yeah.
Okay. Good to know. More research.
Yeah, exactly.
We've also heard the Ontario Poison Control announced October 1st that they're seeing an increase in cases of mushroom poisoning because people are foraging more, and IDing mushrooms is really tricky because they look like poisonous ones versus non-poisonous ones look very similar. Do you have any like advice on sort of people who want to do that?
Yeah, I think it's really cool that foraging mushrooms has become such a popular thing. And I love it because I love seeing everybody's cool mushroom pictures on Twitter. So if anybody wants to see some of the coolest microbes ever and mushrooms ever, I would definitely check out Twitter. But I would say at all times, unless you are an expert mycologist and know everything about mushrooms, I would never eat anything that you pick. I think foraging is very dangerous. It is just not worth the risk because a lot of really poisonous mushrooms look exactly identical to the edible kinds. And so I think it's it's really nice to go out in the forest and try to find mushrooms, and I think it's pretty and it's great to appreciate them, but I think it's not worth the risk to try to eat them thinking that you've ID'd them properly.
Right. That's a really good tip. Another thing that we've seen is the mushroom death suit. I have a picture here. It's from Science Alert. Any like initial thoughts just seeing this picture?
I feel like this picture is so ridiculous. I don't even know what's going on.
Right. And that's why I felt like I had to show it, just because the picture itself, like it needs to be seen.
No, totally. It looks like the person is trapped in a spider web.
Yeah, so the suit apparently relies on the power of mycoremediation. So it's the ability for mushrooms to clean up toxic contaminants in the environment. And the founder chose this strain of mushrooms, fun fact, by feeding them her hair and nails. And another fun fact is actor Luke Perry was actually buried in one last year.
Oh.
Yeah. And it became really popular because of that. So what are your thoughts on this mushroom suit?
Yeah, I think it's cool that people are taking things that happen in nature naturally and trying to be resourceful for them and trying to find new solutions to problems. I think we're all focused on trying to have a smaller effect on the environment. And I think funerals is definitely a difficult one with all of the toxic embalming chemicals and, making expensive coffins out of wood and stuff like that. So I think it's cool that they're coming up with innovative solutions. But I also think if you were to take a body and not wrap it in mushrooms and throw it in the ground, it would decay because that's what happens to all living organisms in the wild. Animals die all the time. And in the ground, there's lots of mushrooms there. There's lots of different microbes that all work together to cause decomposition. So I don't necessarily think you need a mushroom suit in order to decay.
Okay, good to know. And then there's like another coffin-like thing. I don't know. It's a creepy photo, I think, in a way.
Yeah.
Weirdly staged. But this is from, I think this photo is from Green Matters, and CBC also did an article similar to this. This is the loop cocoon casket, and it's also made of mycelium, so the underground root structure of mushrooms, if I have that correct. Yeah. And then according to the founder, it's used in Chernobyl to clean up the soil from the nuclear disaster, and the same thing happens in our burial places because the soil is super polluted there, and mycelium really likes metals, oils, and microplastics. It provides nutrients to the plants growing around it. It can neutralize toxic substances, and it can clean up soil by converting waste products into nutrients.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it would be really creepy if they left the coffins like that and didn't bury them. I think you would definitely want to bury them.
Especially the one like leaning against the tree.
Yeah, leaning against the tree would be a bad way to go. But what I would say here is I think it is an interesting idea to cut down on the amount of trees that we're using to build coffins. So I think like that's cool. I think maybe an approach to take would be to use less toxic chemicals in embalming if your goal is to get the body to decompose. I think our current funeral practices in Canada are usually made people are embalmed to keep them from decaying, and then they are buried in such intense caskets so that they don't decay rapidly. And I think if we moved to a different realm where if the goal was to decay more, we would just have funerals quicker, so there wasn't enough time for them to decay without embalming. And then I think using innovative materials for coffins, I think could be environmentally friendly. So I think it's a cool idea.
Yeah.
But there are still mushrooms in the ground.
Yes, we can still rely on those ones for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think we're all talking a lot about what to do, at the end of our life in terms of, burial sites, and even I forgot the cremation. There we go.
Yeah.
Because even I always thought cremation was nice just because you save space, but also I think the burning produces some toxic gases and not quite so environmentally friendly. So I think, yeah, it's good to keep thinking about these ideas. We have one question who really likes this death theme that we're going with. But if you dispose a body in the desert, what would happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I listened to a horrifying podcast about this once. That I'm trying to think of. It was one of the, I don't know. It was probably This American Life or Radio Lab. It was probably Radio Lab about, and it was on immigration and about people that are trying to immigrate into the States and have to cross the desert, and how it's a really long trek, and that it's really harsh conditions, and a lot of people don't make the trip and they end up dying, and that they're in the desert and what would happen to them. And so what they did was they simulated the situation with a carcass, and then watch what would happen over time to see if it would decay faster or slower. And it actually decayed super, super fast because of the heat, but also because there's so much wildlife out there. So they had lots of birds that would eat the body, and lots of different animals that would come. So maybe it wasn't decomposing, but within a couple of days, the whole carcass was gone, which is horrifying.
It is. Yeah. But I guess in a way, it's like anywhere the body is, decomposition will sort of happen in some shape or form.
Exactly.
Different. Yeah.
Exactly.
We have another question about what is the scariest microbe you've ever encountered in a lab? Hopefully in a lab. Is the addendum to the question.
So Canada has really strict guidelines for working with microbes in the lab. So we do not work with anything super scary. And if you do, there's special labs in Winnipeg that have the super high secure areas that can work on the scariest microbes. So in a normal lab at the University of Toronto, we work on pretty low key things. But I really think that the scariest microbes that we have to worry about right now are ones that are resistant to the drugs that we have available. So right now we're having a huge problem with antibiotic resistance, and as well as antifungal resistance and resistance to all of the different biological agents that we have to kill these infections. And that's a lot because of misuse of antibiotics, especially in farming and in growing animals for consumption. And so I think that what scientists are really afraid of are these superbugs that one day could make it so that regular procedures like surgeries will be impossible to have, because you'll get an infection from the hospital and we won't have a way to treat it. So I think superbugs are definitely the scariest.
I agree. Thank you so much, Amanda, for all of your great answers and your presentation. Of course, it was very fun and also a little bit scary, but reassuring at the same time. So thank you so much. We've lost Selena, but I would like to bring Jen back in as well to thank you for being a part of this. I think everyone really enjoyed all of your presentations. Very fun and entertaining and enlightening at the same time. And so for our wrap up, actually, we're going to kind of look at our how to trick or treat this year with COVID. I know that things look a little bit different and people are worried that it's not going to be as fun. So our first rule is really just follow your local public health guidance. That's definitely going to be number one here to make sure that everything is done safely. Another thing that we've seen is to share individually wrapped candy, so nothing that's sort of without a wrapper. And you can also use loot bags and like place them on your porch. And we've also seen like using tongs to hand out candy. I also stumbled upon someone else saying we could use like hockey sticks, which is like super Canadian to do. Do you guys have any ideas on this sort of tip?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think that's a great idea. I think the name of the game for this is always going to be to keep your distance, and to always try to find a way so that you're never in large groups. And so anything where you can drop the candy maybe on a table and then walk away and have the kids approach and pick it up, I think is a good idea to stay safe. But I also think for people who don't feel comfortable going out, that's okay too. There's lots of fun things that you can do at home to still have the same spirit. So maybe doing a scavenger hunt and hiding candy and letting the kids find it. Or I also saw this really cute cartoon about using the doors in your house.
Yeah.
And kids going around and knocking on the bathroom door, and then there's a parent behind there with candy and just simulating it so that kids can still have fun. But I think going for walks on Halloween, keeping your distance, making sure you're wearing masks, making sure you wash your hands or sanitize your hands very often, and especially before you eat any candy, I think is super important.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, we also saw some really creative ideas of using like a candy chute. Apparently, yeah, I love it too. It's well decorated. Apparently, some local plumbers are actually offering to do this in exchange for donations to local food banks and charities. So I think this is a really great option. I've also heard using zip lines, which is also really fun. And exactly what you mentioned from Twisted Doodle, she had this great idea for using doors. So definitely go check out that Instagram for details about how to make that fun. I love this because you can also change your costume throughout the night. I always struggle with costumes, so maybe not great for me, but in just general, sort of switching it up. And definitely like a scavenger hunt for sure. I feel like, why isn't that already a thing? We do this,
right?
Sure. Yeah, like
yeah. Well, I think that's super fun.
Yeah, and then I think whatever the other ones that we had was a physically distanced costume parade. I think that would be really fun. It's a walk. You don't really have to like interact with anybody, but you're in your little household. But it's fun because you get to show off your costume. And Jen, do you have any ideas about costumes? Like, because we're told to like wear a mask, for example, but we can't wear a costume mask. That's not really going to do the same thing, and we don't want to put it on top of our mask because it might affect our breathability. So like, I think we have to get creative with our costumes and wearing a mask.
Well, I've been seeing some really fun costumes for like Zoom hangouts for people who are like meeting online for Halloween party, because like with a background, especially like a green screen background, you can do some really fun stuff.
Yeah, play around with Zoom there. Yeah,
I've seen people like they'll dress up and they'll put themselves in like Jurassic Park or something. Upgrades.
Oh my gosh, that's brilliant.
Like, I even like this. Like I just have my black background, and I realized like with my office chair, like I look like an evil villain.
Oh, you
do.
Totally
like a cat or something.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah.
You definitely need a cat for sure.
I've seen those like cat skeletons. You could just like pet a cat skeleton. That's awesome. And then like I've also seen some of those like masks that's already decorated to be Halloween themed. And it made me think actually, Jen, when you were talking about how hiding part of your face is already creepy enough, like you're not being able to see the entire face, not really sure what's going on. That in itself is already a scary concept. So I think with us having to wear masks we can definitely do a lot with that. A little goes a long way. So I think that's it for us. Thank you so much, Jan and Amanda, and also Silita for joining in with us today. And I want to thank our audience for watching and commenting as well. So we hope you enjoyed today's presentations and you can wow your friends and family with what you've learned. Please share your feedback with us and let us know what you'd like to see from us in the future. We should have a link coming up on the screen and in the chat box. Next month, our book club chats with science writer Edward Struzik about wildfire. We can explore the problem of misinformation with professor, author, and television presenter Timothy Caulfield and discover the challenges and solutions of aging in a modern world. Details about our upcoming events can be found on our website, rciscience.ca/what's-on. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope you have a great Halloween, a safe and great Halloween.